In the summer of 2018, I was told that Africa had won the World Cup. And indeed, the French team that defeated Croatia in the final was largely representative of France's former colonial empire in Africa. Players who either hailed directly from or had lineage from Senegal, Mali, North Africa, etc. The truth of the matter is that Africa did not win the World Cup in 2018. Senegal, Egypt, Nigeria, they all went home in the group stages. Rather, neo-imperialism or imperialism won the World Cup. Hello, welcome back, guys. It's Professor Matt, and welcome to a long overdue episode of Too Many Guys History. Right. I originally planned on recording this episode all the way back in towards the end of June. Right. But then summer one became summer two. And if you're here in the northeastern part of the United States, it got hot as hell, and we do not have an air conditioner in this office. So sitting down and recording, particularly a longer formatted episode, did not seem particularly appealing to me. However, it has cooled down significantly, and summer two is winding to its inevitable close. So I figured, hey, let's do this. In our last sort of series within this series, we talked about the 1966 World Cup, the African boycott, and North Korea. Today we're going to talk about, well, Algeria, but really as much France as we talk about Algeria, and how, the Algerian National Liberation Movement had their own football team. Football was, a integral part of the Algerian liberation struggle in the 1950s and the 1960s, and also too talking a little bit about the extremely contradictory. And I think contradiction is going to be the, buzzword for this episode, of French football and its relationship to its, former colonial empire, and also to the contradictory attitudes in France about the, you know, ideology, the core, the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and race. And so bear with me here. uh where does the story begin, or our story begin? Well, technically it begins all the way back in 1830, right? Algeria was, the first major colony in the French overseas empire. At least after, the Napoleonic period, and they lose Haiti, etc. Uh, and in many ways, Algeria functioned in the French Empire, sort of like India did in the British Empire. It was sort of the jewel in the crown. But Algeria was different from British India in one major way. British India was an exploitation colony. Yes, there were a lot of Brits that got sent down there. I mean, the Indian Civil Service, the British India Army. But, ordinary Brits did not go to India to live. I mean, they might have owned, tea plantations or something, but, you didn't see any kind of settlement. The Indian Raj was not a settler colony. Algeria was. And, as the 19th century moves on and France begins to industrialize, the various people in the center, landless former peasants, the French working class in places like Paris and Marseille, that were living in slums just like they were everywhere else in the world at that time. Right. And, political dissidents, anarchists, socialists. Algeria in the French Empire became that place where you exported your perceived social ills at home. Uh, so you maintained peace at home, social peace at home, uh, by doing imperialism abroad. And in that sense, Algeria wasn't all that different from, let's say, Northern Ireland in the British Empire, German Southwest Africa in the German Empire, the frontier in regards to the United States. Is this place that where the tensions at the core, Siberia and the Russian Empire would be another wonderful analogy, where you could take people that were unwanted and dangerous in the core, and you could send them off to the periphery, right? And you don't just send them off to the periphery, you give them stuff, right? You give them privilege, you give them wealth, you give them power, not absolute power, but effectively you turn these people that were dangerous at home into junior partners of empire abroad. And so Algeria looked very much like what Franz Fanon, who's mainly commenting on Algeria, said about colonial society, right? For Fanon, the colonial world is a world divided in two. The dividing line, the border, is represented by the barracks and the police stations. In the colonies, the official legitimate agent, the spokesman for the colonizer and the regime of oppression, is the police officer or the soldier, right? What is he talking about here? Well, effectively, he's talking about apartheid, right? Algeria in the 12 by the time you get to the 20th century is an apartheid society, right? Because by, the 1920s, 10% of the Algerian population are these settlers. And in many cases, by that point, they're second, third generation settlers. So, they're white French metropolitans, but many of them have been born in Algeria. They're called the Pied Noir, Blackfeet, which I've heard like 5,000 different reasons why they're called Blackfeet, none of which really make sense. Or simply Calons, Calons. And again, they represent roughly 10% of the population. Uh, but here's the thing. They owned 90% of the colony's wealth. 75% of the arable land, so that's the land that you can actually do shit with. Right? And they enjoyed the full rights of any French citizen. For the indigenous population, which was majority Arab, but also Berbers, uh, they were subjected to endemic poverty either in the countryside or in the major urban centers in sort of walled off, ghettoized neighborhoods, the Kasbah. And right, they did not have the full rights of French citizens, right? They were just separate legal systems. So, like, if you committed a crime and you were quote unquote French, you got a regular trial like you would in France. If you were an Arab, you got sent to a military court where you were presumed guilty before you were innocent. So South Africa, wow, Algeria in the French Empire looked a lot like South Africa under the apartheid regime, where you have like 10% of the population that controlled all the power, all the wealth, and the indi large majority of the population, the indigenous population, which were quite literally second class, in many cases third class citizens in their own countries, and stuck in this, very deliberate cycle of endemic poverty. Right. So already Algeria, you see going back to like I was saying before, contradictions, right? You have, a France that is all about the ideals of the French Revolution. And indeed, if you're quote unquote French, if you're a white dude, you could enjoy all of the benefits of that. But if you're not really deemed French, not so much, right? And Algeria, by the 1930s, is actually technically part of metropolitan France, but it's part of metropolitan France where 90% of the population, I don't have rights, really, so it's this sort of crazy situation. Football comes to Algeria with the settlers, right? And there are clubs established in the colony as early as the 1880s. And you get the first, quote unquote, they were called Muslim clubs, established just slightly after World War One. Football, however, wasn't simply imported to Algeria. Algerians and indeed Africans themselves are imported and start to enrich French football, right? Because the first wave of African players coming to play the game in France really kicks off in the 1920s and particularly the 1930s. The first big uh, player of color in France is a fellow by the name of Raoul Dinga, who came from what is today Senegal and played, his club football in France. He was quickly followed by North Africans, in particular Rashid Maloufi and Mustafa Zinodine. By the way, all of these guys not just played their club ball in France, but uh, represented the French national team. So like in the 1938 World Cup, there are at least four players on that team from France's overseas empire. And so it's weird, right? If you're a colonial subject, you're a second-class citizen in your own country. But you can go to France, sell your footballing labor for a wage, you play football there. And right, you could even be on the French national team, right? The French national team was a lot more diverse than a lot of their even other fellow European empires at that time. The problem, of course, is even then, right, contradictions. So football in France was always seen as sort of a working class, game. Right, something for the outsiders to play. And in many cases, immigrants, right? France, like every industrialized country, had waves of immigration starting in the mid 19th century, excuse me. And right, large numbers of Italians, Poles, Spaniards, you know, the football was their game. So the fact that you have Arabs and sub-Saharan Africans, Black Africans, playing football, while this would seem to be a case of all right, this is inclusion, this is the French revolution at work. It's still kind of contradictory, and indeed, in the 1930s. Right, you have French universalism, right? Liberty, equality, universal rights. But at the same time, you have this exclusionary stuff because, you know, French commentators during the period are saying, well, it's okay if black people or Arabs play football, right? Because that's football, that's a game played by, the street urchins of Paris and these Italians and Eastern Europeans and Spaniards, right? Uh, as long as they're not playing rugby or cycling, it's okay, right? Because those two sports, particularly rugby at the time, because people forget rugby really was the first sport in France, pretty much up until World War II. Uh, these were seen as French sports, and therefore these were spaces where only metropolitan French white people could participate in. So if you're black or you're an Arab, yeah, you can play football, but don't no rugby, no cycling for you. And so even, in the 30s, as you have a genuinely multi-ethnic, multicultural French national team. There's this weird, okay, well, you guys aren't really quite French, therefore you can play football. No rugby, no cycling for you. And so again, there's these contradictions, these very real contradictions. Football is okay because you guys really aren't French. Fast forward to the end of World War II. France is on the winning side, but really by default, right? They get bailed out by, the United States, Britain, and really the Soviet Union too. Right. And within 5 years of the end of World War II, France is weaker than West Germany in defeat, right? The West German economy, once it gets going, it gets going. The French economy stagnates and really doesn't fully recover from the war until the 1960s, largely because of what I'm about to get into. Right. And you also have this flood of, for lack of a better term, Americanization, or as the French called it, Coca-Cola colonialism, right? France is still technically a great power. They have a big overseas empire, etc. But really, in the post-war universe, they don't really matter that much, right? Uh, and so the empire was like the only thing that they could hold on to be like, yes, we are France, we are a great nation still. Right. And so, unlike Britain, unlike some other, colonial powers, French decolonization, although British decolonization was equally, if not more so, violent, right? It looks more violent, at least in your face, because they literally have to be bombed or thrown out, escorted out of their colonies at gunpoint. And indeed, in 1954, they get chucked out of Vietnam. The Viet Minh defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, and then the French leave, but they give us the United States South Vietnam. It's a baton race. They give us South Vietnam, and then all of that happens. More about that in the next episode, by the way, because Vietnam is the next place we're going to. Right. So, they get out of Vietnam, but Algeria, like I said earlier, because of its unique place within the French Empire, that was where they were going to draw a line in the sand. Also in 1954, based partially on the Vietnamese model, you see the emergence of a group called the Front Libération Nationale, the FLN, which is a Arab socialist Algerian Liberation Organization, which had its armed wing, which engaged in guerrilla, hit and run warfare in the countryside, in the mountains in Algeria, but also urban guerrilla war, which I guess we would call terrorism. Right. And if you're interested in that, you can see there's an excellent film, The Battle of Algiers, which you can check out. So, I'm not going to go into that all that much, but needless to say, all of a sudden in 1954, you have the beginning of the Algerian liberation struggle. Uh, like all conflicts of decolonization, and we've already seen this, South Africa, next week we'll talk about Vietnam. Those of you who, are paying attention to what's going on in the Middle East, Palestine, all of these struggles were implicitly globalized. Right. So the Algerian War of Independence wasn't simply the FLN versus the French army. It was the French army, the French state, the French colonial establishment versus pretty much the world and global public opinion and domestic public opinion, right? Because the war within a couple years becomes extremely unpopular in France, mainly because France has a conscript army and they keep telling their population, oh, we're winning this war, but the war just keeps going on. Sounds like Vietnam or Iraq. It's because it is. All right. And, it becomes pretty clear early on that the French are using torture. And, right, democracies, again, contradictions, liberty, equality, fraternity. Democracies don't torture people. If you live in a country that tortures people, you don't live in a democracy. And so, it's not just global opinion, world opinion that France has to fight in this conflict. It's fighting a public opinion battle at home because quite literally by the end of the war, the war has effectively created a civil war in France between the far right who want to stay in Algeria through hell at high water and the French left and increasingly, the French center as the war becomes increasingly unpopular. So, with that being said, where the hell does football enter into this? Well, like I said, the war is globalized. And the FLN know that. And like I said, the FLN sort of copied their strategy on the Vietnamese. They saw what the Vietnamese did and how it worked. And one of the reasons the Vietnamese were so successful was they were able to globalize their struggle in the context of, not just globalization, decolonization, around the world, but also the Cold War. The FLN understands this. And right, in addition to, sending operatives to Cairo so that they could get on the Voice of the Arabs radio station and give you effectively the play-by-play of the national liberation struggle and a counter narrative to the French, narrative of the war. Uh, they also understand that sport is a major legitimizing factor. And in this sense, sport in regards to being able to field a team, even though your country is not independent, it doesn't have a seat in the UN, it's not recognized even by a lot of the quote unquote progressive, uh, you know, uh, uh, global South states, not initially recognized by the socialist bloc either. Uh, Getting a team to play. Because if you have a team, even though you don't have a seat at the UN, you effectively exist. And every time you play, that is a victory for the cause. And the thing is, there are plenty of Algerians who can kick ball, particularly, and again, in France itself. So in 1956, the ALN, which was the armed wing of the FLN, announce that they're forming a football team, a club team essentially, in Tunis. And they do play one match on June 1st, 1958, against the Tunisian national team. Tunisia was also a French colony in North Africa. They had achieved independence years earlier, and Tunisia becomes one of the bases of operation for the FLN and its political wing. Uh, but the ALN team doesn't last very long because the political organization, the FLN, sees this and they say, oh, this is really cool. Let's just take this a step further and create a FLN, effectively an Algerian national team. And then we could go around and we can play friendly teams and maybe even friendly national teams in the future. So, in 1958, the same month that the ALN team plays their one and only match, right before the start of the World Cup, which France is in, by the way, 12 Algerian players disappear in France. 11 of them wind up getting to Tunis. One guy, unfortunately, gets arrested, Charibi, who played for Monaco. He was arrested on the border with Italy, not because the French knew that he was going to dip and, join the other side, right, but simply because he was a brown guy, and especially in the context of the war in Algeria, all Arabs were suspected. So he got caught up at a checkpoint and they were like, what are you doing here? So he does get arrested. Right. So right literally right before the World Cup, 12 Algerian players dip, including at least three guys who probably would have been in that French team. And they show up in Tunis and, they get before the cameras and the FLN, says, this is the Algerian national football team. This is the 11, quote unquote, of independence. So you have these 11, Algerian players that have been playing in France at the club level and could have represented France internationally. And right, guys who had played football like at an amateur level or at, were professional but didn't go so well, that were in the ranks of the FLN already. So you have a country in Algeria, or should I say this? You have a liberation organization that has its own national football team now. And this is a huge deal. It is a huge embarrassment for the French, right? Because they're amongst the favorites for the World Cup. And now every time, there's a press conference, they have to talk about these 11 Algerian guys, which is the whole point of this, right? You're doing this not necessarily even to win many matches, but the funny thing about this Algerian team is they do. Right. It's to get on the news, to have people talking about you, to have all eyes on Algeria, right? Because the colonizer controls the narrative. He sets the news. So, in the lead up to the World Cup, no one's talking about Algeria, right? But now everybody has to because you can't not talk about it. It's a real deal. And so in 1958, you have an FLN Algerian national team. So the team, and more about this in a second, uh, their manager uh, was a manager at the club level in Algeria, and he had also managed in the French second division. So they also poached, again, these colonial metropolitan ties. Uh, it's an interesting team. Right, the core of the 11 of independence, the core, the star guys. They had all played in France, right? And when this manager inherits this squad, uh, he's like, we have more attackers than we do defenders. Like the defense is weak. So we're going to play a 4-2-4 all-out attack formation. Right. And this formation and these tactics actually work because the FLN national team ultimately between 58 and 62 play something like 83 matches, and they wind up with 55 wins, which is a hell of a good return when you think about it. Uh, and so, not only is this a team just by its very existence, uh, that is challenging, the French colonial state, they were actually, from what we understand, pretty freaking entertaining too. They played fun ball, attacking football. Right. So the team is announced, but Algeria isn't recognized by damn near anyone on the planet. They don't have a seat in the UN. FIFA, and more, we know everything we need to know about FIFA from, the episode on the boycott of the 66 World Cup. They don't recognize them. They're like, you're not a real country, therefore we cannot recognize you. Right. So who does this FLN team play and what does this achieve? Well, a lot of their early matches are with club teams, so not national teams, even though effectively they are a national team. Club teams in the friendly Arab states. So Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, which is a major supporter of the Algerian cause, Syria, and Iraq. Right. And so they go on these tours, where every match, it's not just a football match, it's, it's a propaganda piece. It's getting the word out there. It's like, hey, all eyes on Algeria. Pretty soon, however, the scope of their, opponents start to get a lot wider. So beginning in 1959, they start playing national team. So they play the Egyptian national team. They play, the Algerian national team. And then they go on a trip. They first go to Asia, where they're hosted by the PRC, the People's Republic of China, right? And they play a match there. And now China, or mainland China, is not a FIFA member at this point. So it's really two kind of outcasts playing each other. They then play in Vietnam. And that's a big deal. And that's a big deal for two reasons. First of all, the connection between the Vietnamese and Algerian struggle, these two countries that are resisting imperialism, in the case of Algeria, French, in the case of Vietnam, formerly French, now American. Right. This is a big deal, but it's the next leg of the tour that is actually probably more important. They go to Eastern Europe. Now, most of the socialist bloc did not recognize Algerian independence. That comes late in the conflict, around the time the French are getting out. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the French Communist Party was actually on the fence on the issue for at least the first 3 years of the conflict. It's one of the reasons that you start to see this sort of cleavages within the French left, because the traditionally Stalinist, pro-Soviet French Communist Party is totally on the wrong page when it comes to the Algerian conflict. But by the late 50s, because of the Soviet and also larger Eastern European socialist commitment to decolonization struggles, even though they don't recognize Algerian independence yet, Algeria becomes part of the litmus test. And so, in order to, fully say, hey, we support the freedom struggles of all of the oppressed peoples, hosting the FLN national team is probably a good thing. And especially because once you get to 1959, think about the first leg of that tour, the Sino-Soviet rift has broken out. And the Chinese are telling everybody that the Soviets are a bunch of revisionists. They're not really communists anymore. The Chinese, we are the center of the worldwide proletarian revolution. And because we're not white, we actually understand these decolonization struggles way more than the Soviets, who are just a bunch of imperialists anyway. So damage control, right? Because you don't want you if you ignore the Algerians and you don't play their football team, the Chinese argument makes sense, and you don't want the Chinese argument to make sense. So the FLN roll up and they play a series of friendlies against club teams from Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. In fact, they play Central Red Army Moscow uh, in front of a packed house, and they beat them 3-1. So again, exciting team to watch. This tour is incredibly successful. It highlights the Algerian war and the Algerian cause everywhere it goes. It also starts building, it's like I said, it's dual purpose propaganda. It's propaganda for the Algerians because they can say, look, we're not an independent country, but we're playing all these club teams in all of these countries. And, French, you better get the hell out of here. But for the Soviets, for the Chinese, for the Vietnamese, the Poles, the Bulgarians, it's also equally important because it shows their commitment to causes of decolonization. So the 1959 tour is so goddamn successful that the following year, 1960 into 61, the FLN national team decides to do a similar tour. Before that, they also do a tour of Africa where they play Kwame Nkrumah's Ghanaian Black Stars. Right, they lose to Ghana, by the way. They play Egypt again because they always play Egypt. They play Iraq. And so in 1960, they go back to Eastern Europe, but this time it's different. Because the first Eastern European tour, the Eastern Europeans were like, okay, you are a national team, quote unquote, but we can only allow you to play club teams, right? You can play CSKA Sofia, Slovan Bratislava, Liga Warszawa. You can't play our national teams because we still don't recognize you. But by 1960, 1961, the situation in Algeria has changed. And right, the French, particularly after the attempted far right wing coup in France in 1960, ultimately fails the French are looking to get out, and right, the question of recognizing Algeria as a sovereign state in the socialist bloc is becoming much more of a reality. The Arab states had, or most of the Arab states had already recognized Algerian independence, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Morocco, Tunisia, etc. So, but the socialist bloc, which is really important again in context of the global Cold War, they're still on the fence. They have not. But the tour in 1960 and 61, for all intents and purposes, and this tour was covered not just in the Arab press, not just in the press, in Eastern Europe. The French were also watching. And I'm not saying this is why the French ultimately decided to leave Algeria, because it's not. But they must have said, okay, wait a minute, this is the writing's on the wall, we have to leave here. Because the Algerians show up to Eastern Europe. First destination Yugoslavia, by the way, which was one of the, again, Yugoslavia was their relationship, their place within the socialist world was always different because they had broken with Moscow so early. Yugoslavia had been one of the earliest proponents of the Algerian cause. So they show up to Belgrade first. They play Red Star, they play Partisan, then they play the Yugoslavian national team. That's right. And on all the stops they make around Eastern Europe, and they pretty much do the entire block this go around, they play the respective national teams. So, when they were playing Egypt, which, in 1956, the French had joined the British and the Israelis in invading, you know, if they played the Egyptian national team, that's one thing. It's Egypt, right? Or even China, right? Oh, the Chinese, they're not in the UN, no one cares. But when you're at the Central Lenin Stadium in Moscow and they're going toe to toe with the Soviet national team in the European champion Soviet national team, yeah, that's different. That's different. That's quantifiably different. And so this tour, even though the Soviets, the East Germans, the Poles, they don't recognize Algerian independence until much later in that year. When the FLN team is playing those national teams in front of packed houses, recognition has kind of already occurred. And that's a major diplomatic coup for the FLN because this tour sends a very real message to the French and to the entire international community. Look, it's not just, countries in the decolonizing world that recognize us. It's the socialist bloc too, and you have to leave. And indeed, the following year, 1962, the French, they do leave. What's the aftermath of this, right? Because this is where it's funny. You think this is where the story ends. It doesn't. This is where things get murky. So France leaves Algeria, right? They cut bait, and the play a lot of the players that had joined the FLN national team, even though they've become the core of the first proper Algerian national team, right? Because as soon as the French leave, they automatically get FIFA membership. Uh, those players return in many cases to their club teams in France, right? They finish out their careers in French football, right? Because that's where the money is, right? Algeria is literally just become an independent country. They also have to get a league, up and running. And that's the other thing too. It's not just like the propaganda, the optics of this. Every good liberation movement, what they do is they create parallel structures of legitimacy. The French have a court system. Well, we have a court system. The French do marriages. Well, no, we conduct marriages. You see that in the Battle of Algiers. Having a national football team, having the FLN football team was just another aspect of that, right? It's, the French say we don't exist and our best and brightest have to go play for the French national team. Well, no, screw that. We have our own, alternative uh national team, a quote unquote authentic Algerian national team. But a lot of these players that were on the FLN team, they go back and they apply their trade in France. And it's not just players, right? Post-independence Algeria suffers from a lot of the same issues most of these decolonizing countries suffer from. And so what you have in the early 60s, especially because all of a sudden, without wasting, manpower and material fighting these wars you can't win, the French economy all of a sudden skyrockets. Newsflash, the United States government was telling them this throughout the late 50s and the early 60s. The Eisenhower and Kennedy people were like, you have to leave Algeria because you're just doing the Soviet Union's job for them, which ultimately they did, and your economy's trash. And if you want your economy to be good, look at West Germany. West Germany got no colonies. Their economy is fine. Beginning in the 1960s, you have this mass exodus of people, not just from Algeria, but from Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, Cameroon, Mali, etc., pouring into France to serve as, cheap labor in this now booming French economy. And so, like the grandparents of, Kylian Mbappe, fill in the blank French player of color, Zidane. This is when Zidane's, parents showed up to France. It's in the 60s, it's in the second part of the 60s and in the 70s, this mass wave. But it's not just Algerians, Senegalese, etc. In the case of Algeria, it's those white people that are really pissed off that they had to give up their white privilege and had to dip it back to France, a country that they think is theirs, but they've never actually seen. So too is the French beat cop that manned that border. So are, all of the French Empire is in a very real way coming home. It's coming home. Right? It's what never happens to England. It never comes home. Well, in the case of the French Empire, it comes home, and it comes home in a big way. And this is where, again, we have to talk about contradictions. So, if we think about this, we have to think about an external empire, which is going away, and then a kind of internal colonization, right? In the case of France, it means considering the ways that the practices of colonialism, including apartheid, this really contradictory notions of universal rights, but also institutional white supremacy, right, outlived the history of colonialism. With the waning of its empire, France turned to a form of interior colonialism. National administrative techniques developed in the colonies were brought home and put to use side by side with new technological innovations. In the words of one French official, dealing with the rebuilding and restructuring of Paris in the later 60s, so during this boom, Uh, France decolonized the Third World while colonizing Paris, appointing as head of the commission charged with making decisions about the capital functionaries who had made their careers in Black and North Africa, and rebuilding the city largely with an army of cheap colonial immigrant labor. And it's this period where the France that we know really comes about, and it's a France which okay, it doesn't look straight up like Algeria did, but it does kind of feel like it, right? Where, in the cities, you have the people that are wanted, you know, and then just outside the cities, you have the suburbs, effectively the ghetto in the middle of nowhere, where in this case, in many cases, it's the third or fourth generation of these, immigrants from their former colonies who are still treated not totally equal, not totally French, right? And like I said, it's this contradiction because, if you've been paying attention to French football for as long as I have, the last, 30 plus years, when France is good, multicultural, universalistic France is celebrated. And right, this idea that look, in France we have, universal rights and we don't have a I've been told this by a lot of actually very well educated French people. We don't have a race problem in France. And look, it's they say that because they don't do censuses. The census data doesn't have any kind of racial indicators, which in a vacuum sounds awesome, but in practical reality is really problematic and means you is hiding something. There's something you don't want to talk about. And I think that's one of the biggest things too. Contemporary France has always been in denial of its colonial past and has this amnesia about its colonial past. Because let's be real, the French did, like every empire, really shitty things. Particularly when they're trying to hold on to it, torture. So the connections between the empire abroad that's gone, but now this kind of empire at home, those connections which seem clear to us isn't always so clear to them. And so when the French national team does well, it's celebrated as this sort of multicultural success story. But when the French national team does not do well, things are said, right? I remember I was actually in France back in 2006 uh, for the Zidane headbutt. And, Zidane, who, he's one of my five favorite non-Liverpool players of all time. Uh, when he did what he did, the conversation kind of changed because, I heard a lot of, oh, well, he's too hot-headed. Wait a minute. So you're trying to tell me if he was a white dude, he wouldn't have head butted the Italian guy because the Italian guy said what he said. Because that's essentially what you're telling me. He's too hot-headed, that hot-headed Arab, right? These colonial stereotypes that are still very sort of, there. Right. And then, 2002, when France got like, bum rushed at the World Cup by one of its former colonies, Senegal. There was a lot of, well, how French is this team really? And I go back to that quote I started this episode with. Africa won the World Cup. And this is the contradiction. So that was being used by a lot of people on the French center, mainstream centrists, as hey, look, this is how cool multicultural France is. Africa won the World Cup. But you know who else was saying that? The far right Le Pen people, because they were saying that, and they meant Africa won the World Cup and France didn't, because this is not a French team. This is a team of the other, them, the people we don't like. French football is riddled with these contradictions, as indeed French society is. The legacy and the long shadow of the French Empire looms over everything in France. It's palpable. If you've ever been to France, you understand what I mean. Things start getting weird when you start taking the metro in Paris outside the city center and closer to those suburbs, because that's when you start seeing the cops with the submachine guns checking everybody of a certain skin tone's papers, right? I've been to France a couple times. I'm a foreigner. I've never been stopped by a cop and asked for my papers. But if you're an Algerian or, Moroccan or, again, these grandchildren now, in many cases of these immigrants, they're asked that every day of their lives. France decolonized the third world to decolonize France, to colonize France. And those tensions are very real and very much still with us. Uh, and it's something which, not just my, academic interests. Look, being a child of, or my coming of age of this sport was the 1990s. I adopted those French teams in the late 90s as sort of my team because they were so multicultural. They looked so different. Right? And then having seen sort of the various the ways that French society has reacted to that. Uh, you cannot take empire and the story of empire out of the story of French football. It does not work for good and for bad. So that's all I really need to say this go around. Uh, Look out for the next episode. I want to record it and get it out there, ideally before my semester starts, so sometime in this month of August. And that will be on Vietnam. And so check that out. And right, also expect an Eastern European update probably pretty soon. I'm planning on recording that either later today or sometime tomorrow. So that should be up relatively soon. And also before the start of the Premier League season proper, a Liverpool kind of season preview, transfer window. Well, not really wrap up because right, the transfer window shuts in September, but transfer window up until that point. So check out that. And right, we're gonna be back, guys, because we are kind of reformulating this whole thing. So expect weekly, or if not weekly, bi-weekly episodes of the pod. Definitely with Mike and Orsted and at least one of us, uh, starting in the not too distant future. Anyway, gang, hope you're all well. Hope you guys are all cool. This is Professor Matt for the Too Many Guys Sports channel. Uh, Take care of yourselves.